Scientists just finished mapping the deepest DNA history of East Asia ever put together. They pulled genomes from skeletons thousands of years old, compared them to people living today, and found something that does not fit the story most of us grew up believing. One region on the map behaves differently from almost everywhere else on Earth. And once you understand why, you will never think about ancestry the same way again. The old textbook version of this story usually starts with a single, simple question. Which ancient civilization is the true ancestor of the people living in a given region today? For most of the 20th century, that question got answered mostly through guesswork, language comparisons, and pottery styles, because there was no way to look directly at the biology of people who lived thousands of years ago. Ancient DNA sequencing changed that completely. It let scientists stop guessing and start measuring, comparing actual genetic material recovered from actual human remains against the genomes of people alive right now. And what that measurement revealed about East Asia turned out to be far more interesting than a simple yes or no answer to who came from where. For a long time, the standard picture of human history went something like this. Civilization started in a few key spots, places like the Fertile Crescent, and then spread outward. Ideas moved, people moved, and populations mixed and replaced each other over and over. In most of the world, that is basically what the DNA shows. Europe is the clearest example. Around 5,000 years ago, herders from the steppes north of the Black Sea, a population geneticists usually call the Yamnaya, pushed westward into Europe in huge numbers. Within a few centuries, their DNA had spread across much of the continent, and in some regions, it replaced the majority of the male lineages that existed before they arrived. Then came another wave. Bronze Age. Britain saw a fresh population arrive from the continent, associated with a new style of pottery called the Bell Beaker culture, and that migration reshaped the local gene pool again in a remarkably short window of time. Layer on top of layer, population on top of population. Modern Europeans are, genetically speaking, a patchwork built from several very different founding groups stacked on top of each other over thousands of years, with each new wave leaving a heavy genetic footprint on the ones before it. It is worth sitting with that Yamnaya migration for a moment, because the scale of it is genuinely hard to grasp. Geneticists studying ancient European remains found that, in some regions, the Y chromosome lineages carried by men before the migration almost completely vanished from the record within just a few centuries of the steppe herders arriving. That is not a gradual blending playing out over thousands of years. That is closer to a population being overwhelmed and largely displaced within a handful of generations. And the Bell Beaker migration into Britain a bit later did something similar on a smaller geographic scale, reshaping the ancestry of the British Isles so thoroughly that the people living there before its arrival contributed only a modest fraction of the ancestry of the people living there afterward. When historians and geneticists talk about Europe's population history, this is the backdrop they are working against. Repeated, large-scale genetic turnover, driven by migrations that moved fast and left deep marks. China does not look like that. And that is the part that surprised the researchers. Starting in the mid-2010s, geneticist Qiaomei Fu and her team in Beijing began extracting DNA from human remains scattered across China, some of them tens of thousands of years old. The goal was simple: figure out who actually lived in East Asia in deep prehistory and how they relate to the people living there now. What they found was a split. Ancient people from the Yellow River region in the north carried one distinct genetic signature. Ancient people from the coast of southern China carried a different one. The research uncovered shared DNA across the Yellow River region tied to the rise of Chinese civilization, and it turned out to be distinct from a separate southern East Asian ancestry found along the coast of southern China. And that southern signature was already showing up in people living there 9,000 years ago, long before any of the civilizations we usually picture when we think ancient world had even gotten started. So there were, broadly speaking, two deep ancestral populations in what is now China. One centered on the Yellow River in the north, one centered along the southern coast, closer to the Yangtze region and beyond. Both were already old, already genetically distinct from each other, and both were already established long before anything resembling written history began. Here is where it gets interesting. Instead of one of these groups disappearing or getting wiped out, the genetic record shows them spreading into each other over thousands of years and blending. This was not a story about one group replacing another. It was a story about mixing again and again at different times, in different places, at different intensities, until the boundary between northern and southern ancestry became a gradient rather than a hard line. Before we go further, it helps to understand how scientists even do this kind of work, because the process itself is part of what makes the findings trustworthy. Researchers extract tiny fragments of DNA preserved inside the dense part of the inner ear bone, or the roots of teeth, the two places where genetic material tends to survive best over thousands of years. They sequence that DNA, compare it against reference genomes from populations all over the world, and look at specific markers, things like mitochondrial DNA passed down only through mothers, and Y chromosome DNA passed down only through fathers, which act almost like family surnames that persist for thousands of generations. By tracking how these markers cluster together and how closely related different ancient individuals are to each other and to people alive today, scientists can reconstruct migration patterns that left no written record at all. Combined with radiocarbon dating of the bones themselves, this lets researchers build a timeline of who lived where and how those populations connect to one another, purely from biology. To understand how the northern story started, you have to go back to the Yellow River heartland itself, to a culture archaeologists call Yangshao. Yangshao communities lived along the middle stretch of the Yellow River, roughly between 6,500 and 5,000 years ago. They farmed millet, kept pigs, lived in organized villages, and produced striking painted pottery decorated with geometric patterns and animal motifs that still show up in museums today. This was not a marginal culture experimenting on the edge of civilization. It was, according to the genetic data, the single biggest source population feeding into almost everything that came after it across huge stretches of East Asia. Take the region of southwest China, hundreds of kilometers from the Yellow River itself. You would expect the DNA there to look mostly local, shaped by whoever was already living in that mountainous terrain. Instead, researchers studying ancient genomes from sites called Gaoshan and Haimenkou found something startling. Roughly 90% of the ancestry at both sites traced back to Yellow River farmers from the Yangshao culture. That is not a trace amount of contact through trade. That is a population whose ancestry was overwhelmingly rooted in a region far to the north and east, carried there by people who physically migrated, not just by ideas or goods passed hand to hand along trade routes. And this fits a bigger pattern that keeps showing up across separate, independently conducted studies. Millet farming, and the people who practiced it, moved outward from the Yellow River Basin in multiple directions over thousands of years. Genetic and archaeological evidence together point to movement onto the Tibetan Plateau by around 5,300 years ago, and further movement of both millet and rice farming, along with early Tibeto-Burman languages, into southwest China by roughly 4,500 years ago. Wherever these Yellow River-related populations went, they left a strong genetic signature behind, mixed with whoever was already living there before them. But the Yellow River was never the only center of innovation. Down in the Yangtze River Delta, a completely separate and, in some ways, even more advanced society was developing in parallel. Archaeologists call it the Liangzhu culture, and it flourished in what is now northern Zhejiang and southern Jiangsu province between roughly 3,300 and 2,300 BCE. The Liangzhu people were rice farmers first and foremost, but they were also master engineers. They built an enormous hydraulic system of dams, canals, and reservoirs to manage flooding and irrigate their fields, technology that predates comparable water management systems, found almost anywhere else in the ancient world. Their main settlement covered around 300 hectares, larger than the footprint of the old Forbidden City, complete with palace foundations, ceremonial altars, and defensive walls. And they were obsessed with jade. Elite burials at Liangzhu sites contained astonishing quantities of carved jade objects. Ceremonial discs, called bai, and tubes, called kong, worked with a precision that still puzzles craftsmen trying to replicate it with modern tools. Commoners were buried with simple pottery, while the elite were buried surrounded by jade, silk, and ivory, a clear sign of a stratified, organized, state-level society. Some archaeologists now consider Liangzhu the earliest true state-level civilization yet discovered in East Asia, and its cultural influence reached as far north as Shanxi and as far south as Guangdong. Genetically, Liangzhu and the wider Yangtze rice farming world were a different population from the Yellow River millet farmers to the north. Recent genome sequencing from Yangtze sites belonging to the Daxi, Songze, and Liangzhu cultures shows this population sharing close genetic ties with other Neolithic groups from southeast China, forming a distinct ancestral cluster of its own, separate from the Yangshao world upriver. In other words, China's two oldest complex societies, the millet farming north and the rice farming south, were not the same people wearing different regional clothes. They were genuinely separate populations, with separate crops, separate technologies, and separate genetic histories, developing in parallel for thousands of years before they ever fully merged. And merge, they eventually did. The most detailed recent work on how that merging played out comes from the lower Yangtze region itself, the old Liangzhu heartland. Long after the original civilization there had collapsed around 2300 BCE, likely due to catastrophic flooding. When scientists sequenced ancient genomes from people buried in that same region between the 10th and 20th centuries, nearly 2,500 years after Liangzhu's collapse, they found something that speaks directly to how stable the whole system had become by then. Most of the individuals derived somewhere between about 70 and 100% of their ancestry from Yellow River-related populations, with the remainder coming from an older southern East Asian genetic layer, the last surviving trace of the original rice farming population. In other words, over roughly 3,000 years, Yellow River-related ancestry had spread south and become dominant even in the old heartland of a completely separate, independently developed civilization, while never fully erasing the genetic signature of the people who had built that civilization in the first place. And it does not stop with the medieval period. The same study found that Han Chinese people living in that same lower Yangtze region today can be modeled as direct genetic descendants of those historical individuals from 1,000 years ago. That is an extraordinary amount of continuity. Dynasties rose and fell, wars were fought, trade networks expanded and collapsed. And through all of it, the underlying genetic makeup of the region stayed remarkably consistent, generation after generation, essentially unbroken from the Song dynasty to the present day. Now compare that to what continent-hopping migrations did to Europe over a similar or even shorter timescale, and the contrast is striking. It is not that China was cut off from the rest of the world, or that nothing ever changed. Migration happened constantly, in multiple directions, over thousands of years. What is unusual is how the different populations blended into each other instead of one wiping out the other. It looks far less like the replacement pattern seen with the Yamna migration into Europe, and far more like slow, repeated absorption, playing out over an enormous stretch of time. Even the far frontiers of China tell the same layered story, rather than a story of pure isolation. Look at the Yellow River Bend, up near the border with the steppe, an area that has always been a contact zone between farming societies to the south and pastoral, herding societies to the north. Ancient genomes from that region, spanning the late Neolithic through the Bronze and Iron Ages, show exactly this kind of mixing in action. Yangshan-related ancestry from the Central Plains formed a major part of the local gene pool there, alongside genetic evidence linking that frontier region to populations as far away as southern China, and archaeologists have even noticed similarities between jade artifacts found at Yellow River Bend sites and those from the distant Liangzhu culture near the coast. So even in a zone shaped by contact with steppe herders, hundreds of kilometers from either the Yellow River core or the Yangtze Delta, the deep genetic and even artistic threads running through the population still traced back largely to those two founding farming traditions. The Tibetan Plateau offers maybe the most remarkable example of how this blending actually worked, because it required more than just people moving in and settling down. Living above 3,500 meters with oxygen levels far below what lowland bodies are built for demands biological adaptations that ordinary farmers simply did not have. And the story of how Tibetans got those adaptations turns out to be one of the strangest chapters in all of human genetics. Deep inside the Tibetan genome, scientists found a version of a gene called EPAS1, which helps the body cope with low oxygen. This version does not match anything found in Han Chinese populations, and it does not match anything found in most humans anywhere on Earth. Instead, it matches the genome of the Denisovans, an extinct group of archaic humans, known mainly from a handful of bone fragments discovered in a Siberian cave, thousands of kilometers away from Tibet. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, the ancestors of modern humans interbred with Denisovans, and that interbreeding left behind a rare genetic variant. Most populations that carry a trace of it lost the variant over time because it offered no particular advantage in a lowland environment. But when farming populations related to the Yellow River world eventually pushed onto the Tibetan Plateau and mixed with the people already living there, natural selection took hold of that ancient, half-forgotten Denisovan variant and spread it rapidly through the population because it was, quite literally, a life-or-death advantage at extreme altitude. Today, the vast majority of Tibetans carry this variant, while it shows up in only a small fraction of Han Chinese and almost nowhere else in the world. It is a genetic gift passed down from a completely different species of human, preserved for tens of thousands of years, and only put to real use once Yellow River farming populations arrived and mixed with the Highlanders who already carried it. Genetic studies of Tibetan and Chang populations more broadly show ancestry rooted in Yellow River-related farming groups, but combined with this and other distinct highland adaptations from people who had already been living at altitude for a very long time. Researchers studying the Chang people specifically describe them as a kind of basal layer of the wider Chinese gene pool, shaped by repeated historical admixture with both Han and Tibetan populations over many centuries. This was not one population steamrolling another. It was two very different survival toolkits, lowland farming genetics and an ancient borrowed highland adaptation, merging into something new, something that could actually thrive in an environment neither original population could have settled alone. There is a cultural parallel to all of this genetic continuity that is worth mentioning, because it reinforces the same underlying pattern. The earliest confirmed form of Chinese writing appears on oracle bones and turtle shells from the late Shang dynasty, roughly 3,200 years ago, used for divination rituals at the royal court. What is remarkable is not just that this writing system exists, but that it is recognizably an early ancestor of the characters still used today. A modern reader with training in classical characters can pick out recognizable elements in inscriptions written more than 3,000 years ago. No alphabet in the Western world has that kind of continuity. Latin script, Greek script, and every alphabet descended from Phoenician writing has changed almost beyond recognition compared to the systems used by their distant ancestors thousands of years ago. Chinese script did change over the centuries, but it evolved rather than being replaced outright, the same way the underlying population evolved rather than being replaced outright. Culture and genetics, in this particular part of the world, both tell a story of gradual transformation instead of abrupt rupture. This same question of continuity versus replacement comes up when researchers look just across the water at Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Ancient DNA studies there show a related but distinct story. An earlier population of hunter-gatherers, associated with what archaeologists call the Jomon culture in the Japanese islands, mixing over thousands of years with farming populations that expanded from the Asian mainland populations that themselves carried significant Yellow River and Yangtze-related ancestry. The exact proportions are still being worked out, and this is very much an active area of research rather than a settled picture, but the broad shape of the story rhymes with what happened inside China itself. An older, deeply rooted population meeting a newer, agriculturally expanding one, and the two gradually blending together rather than one erasing the other. So why does East Asia show this pattern of blending and continuity, while other parts of the world show waves of replacement instead? Researchers point to a few overlapping reasons. Geography is one. The Yellow River Basin sits somewhat protected, with mountains, deserts, and ocean-forming natural boundaries around the core agricultural heartland. That does not mean the region was untouched by outside contact, but it did limit the kind of sudden, large-scale population replacement that reshaped Bronze Age Europe in only a few centuries. Agriculture is another piece of the puzzle. Millet farming in the north and rice farming in the south could support dense, settled populations, and dense populations are simply harder to displace than small, scattered groups. When a farming society with many people packed into a river valley meets a much sparser herding society moving across open grassland, even a successful military conquest does not automatically translate into genetic replacement, because there just are not enough conquerors to outnumber the people already there. The density difference between farming societies and herding societies is worth spelling out a little more, because it explains a lot of what we have already covered. A river valley planted with millet or rice can feed dozens of people per square kilometer, sometimes more, because the crop yield per unit of land is high and predictable year over year. A grassland used for herding livestock supports a tiny fraction of that number, because animals need far more land per calorie of food they eventually provide. That mathematical gap has enormous consequences whenever a herding population and a farming population come into contact. A herding army can win battles, topple governments, and install new rulers. What it generally cannot do is outpopulate a farming society that vastly outnumbers it on the ground. Over 1 or 2 generations, the demographic math simply favors the larger population, and newcomers get absorbed into it rather than replacing it. Add to that the fact that dense farming populations also tend to produce more food surplus, which supports larger armies, more administrators, and more elaborate bureaucracies of their own. And the imbalance becomes even harder for outside conquerors to overcome in the long run, no matter how dramatic their initial military victories might look. This same dynamic, high-density farming societies proving demographically resilient against smaller but militarily successful outside groups, shows up again and again throughout Chinese history, and it lines up closely with what the genetic data actually shows. And then there is culture. Chinese civilization built something unusual very early on, a writing system that stayed legible across huge stretches of time and enormous linguistic diversity. People who spoke mutually unintelligible dialects could still read the same characters. That created a kind of shared identity strong enough to absorb outsiders rather than being erased by them. Groups that conquered China militarily, from Mongol rulers in the 13th century to Manchu rulers in the 17th, ended up adopting Chinese administrative systems and intermarrying with existing elites. Within a few generations, their distinct genetic and cultural identity had largely blended into the surrounding population, rather than the other way around. It is worth pausing here to be honest about what this kind of research can and cannot tell us. Ancient DNA studies work with a limited number of skeletons from a limited number of sites, and every new burial that gets sequenced can shift the picture slightly. Scientists describe their findings using statistical modeling, comparing how well different combinations of ancestral populations explain the DNA of a later group, and they report those results with confidence intervals and margins of error, not absolute certainty. The broad pattern, Yellow River farmers and Yangtze farmers as 2 deep ancestral roots gradually blending together with each other with highland populations, and with surrounding groups over thousands of years, is well supported by study after study from multiple independent labs. But the exact percentages shift a little depending on the specific site, the specific time period, and the specific statistical model used. That is not a weakness of the science. That is just what real science looks like when it is being done carefully, one genome at a time, instead of being flattened into a single dramatic headline. The Mongol case is a particularly good illustration of how thoroughly this absorption process worked. At its height in the 13th century, the Mongol Empire controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and Mongol rule over China lasted for nearly a century under the Yuan dynasty. Given the scale of that conquest, you might expect a substantial, lasting genetic footprint left behind across the Chinese population, something comparable to what steppe migrations did to Bronze Age Europe. Instead, geneticists studying the genetic contribution of Mongol-era rule to the broader Chinese population generally find it to be modest and regionally concentrated, nothing close to the kind of population-wide replacement seen elsewhere in the world after a conquest of similar scale. The conquerors themselves were relatively few in number compared to the population they ruled over, and within a handful of generations, their descendants had largely intermarried into the existing population and adopted its language, its administrative systems, and its customs. Political conquest, in other words, did not translate into genetic conquest because the demographic weight was never on the conqueror's side to begin with. It also means we should be cautious about turning any of this into a story about racial purity or a single unbroken bloodline because that is not actually what the data shows. What it shows is closer to the opposite. Every population discussed here, from the Yellow River farmers to the Yangtze rice growers to the Tibetan highlanders, was already the product of earlier mixing, stretching back tens of thousands of years to the original migrations of modern humans out of Africa, and even further back to encounters with archaic human species like the Denisovans. Continuity in this context does not mean isolation. It means a population that kept absorbing new genetic material over thousands of years without ever being fully replaced or erased. That is a very different and in some ways more interesting story than the idea of an untouched bloodline running in a straight line back to the beginning. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we wrap up, and it has to do with where this ancestry sits today, outside of China's own borders. Millions of people of Chinese descent live scattered across Southeast Asia, in places like Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, as well as in much older overseas communities that trace back centuries. Geneticists studying these diaspora populations generally find that their ancestry still clusters closely with mainland Chinese populations, particularly southern Chinese populations, reflecting the fact that most historical migration out of China moved through southern ports and southern provinces. It is a reminder that the genetic story traced through ancient burials in the Yellow River Basin and the Yangtze Delta is not just a story about people who stayed in one place. It is a story that continued to unfold as people moved outward from that shared ancestral core, carrying pieces of that same deep history with them wherever they settled. Put all of that together, and you get something genuinely rare on the world stage. A region where you can trace a reasonably continuous genetic and cultural thread from Neolithic farming villages thousands of years ago, through the rise and fall of dynasty after dynasty, all the way to hundreds of millions of people living there today. Not because nothing ever changed, and not because the population never mixed with anyone else. It changed constantly. It absorbed newcomers constantly. But instead of repeated total replacement, what you see across study after study is slow, steady blending, with 2 or 3 deep ancestral roots, millet farmers from the Yellow River, rice farmers from the Yangtze, and highland populations further west, feeding into everything that came after. None of this makes East Asia's population history simpler than anywhere else in the world. If anything, it makes it more layered, because instead of a handful of dramatic replacement events that are relatively easy to spot in the DNA, you get centuries upon centuries of quieter, ongoing mixing that researchers have to untangle one ancient genome at a time. That is exactly why studies like these keep getting published, and why the picture keeps getting sharper with every new site that gets excavated and sequenced. That is the real story hiding inside the DNA. Not a single untouched bloodline running in a straight line back to the Stone Age, but something arguably more interesting. The several thousand-year-long process of different populations meeting, mixing, and building something new together in a place where the underlying genetic threads never got fully cut, even when the political map above them was rewritten again and again. Every new ancient genome researchers pull out of the ground adds another data point to that picture, and so far, they all point the same direction. If this kind of deep history detective work is something you enjoy, stick around, because there is a lot more of it coming, and the story is far from finished.